Thank you. And I'm very aware of the fact that I'm literally the only thing standing between all of us and free beer, so I'm sensitive to that. I'll try to make it worth your while. My talk does involve meerkats, toast, unicorns, and people, because people are cool too. So hopefully it kind of brings us back kind of to regular people land. So the original title of my talk was UX rendering metrics, was kind of the title that I proposed to Steve and PPK months ago, and then I realized that's not a very exciting title when I put it on my slide deck, so I changed it to something else. I don't know if you could tell, that's an image from Dr. Strangelove. It's a great movie. You should watch it. So I work at SpeedCurve. We develop synthetic and real user monitoring solutions. And I also, I've known Tim for ages, and I think we could just start a mutual admiration society. He started WPO Stats, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a really great repository of performance case studies that kind of investigate the intersection of performance metrics with business and user engagement metrics, and it's full of really great industry case studies from all over the place, and you can submit your own if you have one. So Tim started it, and he graciously invited me to help curate it, so I do that as well. I talk to a lot of people about performance. I talk to SpeedCurve customers, I come to a lot of conferences, and I talk to people at conferences. And really, when people find out that I'm a user experience person, what they want to know is, what is the best metric for UX? I care about user experience. What should I even be looking at? And then the next question, of course, is what should it be? What should that magic number be that I'm attaching to that metric? And then how can I even stay on track? I'm monitoring a whole site, hundreds, thousands of pages. How do I stay on track with that kind of monitoring? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. But first, I want to talk about toast for a second. In my house, I have the distinction of being the best person at making toast, not just toasted bread, but toasted bagels, scones, crumpets, all kinds of bread. And the reason why I'm really good at making bread making toast is because I'm the only person who really knows how to use the toaster in my house. So it's sort of fallen to me. And this is my toaster. Well, it's not my actual toaster. My toaster looks like this. This is a toaster from the internet, but mine is identical. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart. I can make really, really great toast without even knowing how the toaster works. I have no idea what's going on inside the toaster, what kind of toaster voodoo is happening. This is an illustration I took from an article that you can go and check out and actually read about the physics and chemistry of how toasters work. I scanned it briefly and then realized I didn't care that much. I'll just go back to making good toast. And how I got to be so great at making toast and toast-related products is, did I get that way because I'm a toaster expert? No, I got that way because I watch the toast. I just look at it and I see, is it brown enough? Is it too brown? Is it burned? And then I kind of I fuss around with the dial and I figure out, okay, well, if I want to toast a baguette, I might kind of keep it down at 3. If I want to reheat warm up some frozen pancakes that I've kind of tossed in the freezer, I'll set it to 7. And I know my toaster, I know my bread products, and I know my dial. And that's really all it takes. And that's kind of what I bring to performance as well. So my background is, as you may not have gathered, or you may have gathered, I'm a user experience person. So I've been studying user experience for about 20 years. And before I got into performance, about 10 years ago, it was just about being in the lab. And so this kind of makes me a bit of an outlier in the performance world, because I think most people come to performance from various tools that they use that give you spreadsheets and charts, and they show you metrics with numbers next to those metrics, and the metrics are industry standard, so you just sort of subscribe to them. And I come to performance from having sat in labs and just sort of watch people use the internet, and sometimes have a stopwatch, and just giving them tasks in advance and just seeing what happens and making notes. And you can learn a lot from doing that. And what I learned from doing that is that you really have to trust your eyes. So when I kind of got involved in the performance world and started using great tools like web page test, which I love and I'm a huge fan of, which is great because SpeedCurve's built on top of web page test. But when people started talking to me about different metrics that were available at the time that everybody was sort of coalescing around, I was I felt really out in the dark because I felt like I was being asked to take on faith that these metrics actually meant something meaningful in terms of what users experience. And they might have, or they might not have, but I just felt like I just wanted to know more, and I felt that that wasn't enough. The problem is, the tools that we have, is that we're trying to measure hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of user experiences. And unfortunately, even though as much of an internet peeping Tom as I am, I can't watch all of those people use the internet. So I have to figure out, okay, well, there's all these tools that we have, obviously. How can we get from looking at these millions and millions of sessions where you can kind of see these are individual users, these are individual sessions of people using sites. How can we extract something meaningful from that? How can we get something that actually correlates to real users? These are just a bunch of metrics. I just kind of randomly grabbed some. At some point, what's interesting to me about all these metrics up here is that I have seen over the years, and I'm guilty of doing this as well, I've seen every single one of these metrics conflated with user experience. People have used them in some kind of research to say, yeah, we cared about user experience, we cared about making our pages faster, and so we decided that we were going to aim for this particular target and this particular performance sprint or particular case study or what have you. And this is just tip of the iceberg. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of different metrics that you can track in synthetic and in your real user monitoring. So the question is sort of, you can't track all of them. You would go absolutely bananas trying to track on all of these metrics. And I work with Steve. I'm very lucky. And one of the things that made me realize that Steve and I were kind of kindred spirits, even though he's a deep technologist and I'm kind of over here at the extreme front end looking at users, was this quote that I read that he wrote. This was long before I worked with him, and I'll read it in case there's anybody at the back who can't see the screen. The real thing we're after is to create a user experience that people love and they feel is fast. And so we might be front-end engineers, we might be dev, we might be ops, but what we really are is perception brokers. So I like that idea of being perception brokers. But how, again, kind of getting back to the point that I made earlier, how do we measure perception at scale? How is that even possible? And it's not really possible. It would be great. I would love to be able to say, we figured it out. Everybody go home. But over the past 10 years, we've gotten closer, and I kind of want to share with you a little bit of the journey of how we've gotten to where we are right now, and kind of set the stage for where we're going to go from here. So I really like this article on the Google developer blog. I'll be posting my slides after this talk, so you can get all the links and things like that there. But they kind of ask these 4 questions that I really love. Is it happening? Is it useful? Is it usable? And is it delightful? Now, is it delightful? That's a little bit hard to measure, but I like the fact that we're putting it out there as a goal to be achieved. But is it happening? Is it useful? And is it usable? Those are things that we can kind of work towards a little bit better. If you Google most beautiful unicorn in the world, this is the first image that comes up. I don't recommend you do that because your Google ads are going to get kind of weird afterwards. So just take my word for it. But I put this here because one of the questions that I got asked a couple of years ago by somebody was, well, I just want or they didn't want it. Their executive team wanted it. They wanted a unicorn metric. They wanted this what is that one single metric that we can get everybody to care about? What should that metric be? And it kind of just asks, is there kind of a one-size-fits-all performance metric? And there isn't. I think you probably picked up on that from the tone of everything I've said so far, but I just want to make that really, really clear. But over the past couple of years, we're getting closer. We're getting there. These are some of the things that have been metrics that have been coming up, and I'm going to be drilling down in a little more detail into these in a minute. So at SpeedCurve, we kind of define what we think is the best UX metric. So we think that it should correlate to what users see in the browser, for sure. So, there's no point in having a metric if the browser window is empty. It should be ideally as easy to use as possible. Ideally, even better, just sort of accessible by default, like right out of the box with whatever tool you're using. We think that it should recognize that not all pixels are equal, that some pixels on your screen are more important than others. And that it should allow you to customize, to fine-tune what you're measuring on individual pages on your site, because you know your site, and you know your pages, and you know your goals better than anyone else. So you know that this is the most important image on a product page or an article page. This is the most important call to action button. And you want to measure when people are seeing those things. So this is kind of our checklist. And so kind of getting back to what I was talking about earlier with having a hard time with just sort of looking at charts and looking at spreadsheets that were telling me that, yeah, these metrics are good and these are the targets we should be moving towards. Well, thanks to web page test, we have this great ability with synthetic to actually visually sanity check the metrics that we're looking at. So with web page test, I don't know how many people in this room have experimented with looking at the film strip views of your page rendering, but I highly recommend if you haven't done it, do so. And if you are familiar with it but you haven't been using it, start to use it. It's just a really great way to validate what your metric is with what you're actually seeing as that page renders. And we're going to be coming back to this quite a bit more in the next few slides. So first, a brief history of performance metrics. Load time. Everybody probably knows what load time is. I don't need to read this to you. Now, at the time that I got involved in performance, like I said, around 10 years ago, load time, everybody talked about load time. That was kind of, because it was measurable. And it's sort of, we say now that we move away from load time as a meaningful UX metric. And it's kind of really easy to sort of poo-poo the fact that we ever used it. But 10 years ago, web pages were very different from what they are now. The average page was under 1 meg, believe it or not. And there wasn't so much third-party content. SPAs hadn't really been invented yet. So we weren't worrying about a lot of things that we have to worry about now in terms of measurement. So load time actually kind of made sense. So it was not a bad metric. But nowadays, for all those reasons that I just said, it's not so hot anymore. But we still know that if you take down load time, if you're already pretty fast and you know that you don't have a lot of those other issues that I just described, you can still use load time as a pretty good metric for kind of measuring case studies. So in this case, like BBC knew that for every additional second that it takes their site to load, they lose 10% of their users, as a for instance. Or Ancestry improved load time by 64% and saw a 7% increase in conversion rate. So I still like load time as a metric if it's meaningful to you, if you can actually correlate something to a business metric. Is it a user experience metric? Not really so much, but it's still useful as a business metric. So start render has been around for a long time, and it's the time from the start of the initial navigation, so basically till something actually is visible in the browser. So Amazon, I like to talk about Amazon a lot because everybody does. And so the thing about Amazon that's really interesting is Amazon optimizes for start render and for repeat visits for obvious reasons. Start render is a pretty good proxy for when people start to see something in the browser, and repeat visits because people who are coming to Amazon are probably repeat visitors and their cache is already primed. So these are metrics that they care about. And you can see here, you can see a lot of things here. What you can't see are the other retail sites that I kind of blocked out who they are because I wanted to sort of protect the innocent. But what you can see over in those last two columns is the actual total page size for Amazon on first view and repeat view. And you can also see, kind of in the middle column here, their start render time on first view and repeat view. So it's a pretty stark difference when you look at their start render is less than 2 seconds, despite the fact that they have huge pages, and their total load time is 12 seconds on this particular page. So clearly, load time, not such a big issue for them. Page size, not such a big issue, but start render is a good one. And at speed curve, we use start render as a metric for in synthetic and Lux, our real user monitoring product. And in Lux, we can show people the correlation between start render and bounce rate. So this is a correlation chart where you can see the histogram, all those blue bars. That is the traffic distribution across start render times. And you can see that bounce rate kind of creeps up from about 40% down at 0.4 seconds to almost 80% at 2 seconds. So obviously, in this instance, start render is a pretty meaningful metric for people. It correlates to how people actually behave. So it's good. And then speed index, we can thank Pat Meenan, the creator of Web Page Test, for this one. He created this. It's kind of it's not really a number, it's more of a score, but in speed curve, we actually turned it into a number so that we can kind of show it to you alongside all of your other time-based metrics. Sorry, I should say, it's not actually a time-based metric. It's a 4-digit score, or maybe 5-digit if you're really hurting. But as I said, we turned it into a time-based score at speed curve. And it's just a metric that Pat created to show when all the visible parts of the page have loaded in the viewport. So kind of, I know above the fold is kind of a bit of a dirty word, but I'm going to say it anyways. So trying to measure some sort of above the fold type situation. But even these good metrics can go bad. And so this is, again, getting back to this idea of sanity checking your metrics by looking at film strip views. Here's a film strip view for a site where you can see start render lines up with at 9.47 seconds, and you can see there's not really much in the browser. That's not really, from a user experience perspective, I wouldn't call this usable content. It's not fulfilling any of the criteria that I just talked about. And then at 38 seconds, you have your page load, and 57.85 seconds is the speed index, or 5,785, depending on what tool you use. So this kind of thing happens. And it kind of highlights the fact that how well all of these metrics work really depends on how the page itself is constructed. So I want to kind of give props to all the people out there who work really, really hard in the field to develop new metrics and to have these timings kind of to pull them out of the browser, that sort of thing. But I sort of think of it as being like people in these ideal sterile lab conditions working, trying to build metrics that work, technically perfectly. But then when you're actually facing the real kind of woolly wild west of the web, this is what happens. So you kind of you go from your sterile lab environment to cat rodeo, and suddenly all bets are off. And so that's why you see film strips that look like this. But it's okay. You can still believe, we can still push on, you can find something. So recently, some new metrics have emerged. When I say recently, it's like, in the last year or two, really, that they've kind of come to the forefront. Not first paint, it's been around for ages, obviously. But metrics like first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, first CPU idle, first interactive. And what I like about these, they all use the word first, which is really exciting, because all of us performance people, we hear the word first, and we're like, what? First what? I want to see it. Show me. So first paint, you're probably familiar with this one. Pixels first start to render. First contentful paint. There's a link at the bottom. You can go actually to the spec that was written. It's a Google Doc. So it was written by an engineer at Google to actually read about the different paint timings. So first contentful paint, text and graphics start to render, but it can often catch kind of non-meaningful paints. And then first meaningful paint, so basically is a point after which the biggest, I'm just kind of reading it for the benefit of people in the back, after which the biggest above the fold layout changes happen and web fonts have loaded. So again, you can go to the spec and read more there. So this is us at speed curve. Anytime a new metric comes up, we're like meerkats. We're just like, what? What just happened? new metric? Is it a predator? Is it, and we focus on it, and we just start to analyze the heck out of the thing. And so, kind of got these out of order, but so Joseph Wynn, who I work with, he wrote a really awesome blog post recently, which was an analysis of the different paint timing metrics, because we really wanted to know if we're going to, if the industry is going to start to migrate towards a new standard and a new set of best practices. We just really want to know that what we're doing actually benefits users. And so you can go to his post and read his detailed analysis. And he pulled this quote out, which is from the W3C spec, which is basically just highlighting that how complex the rendering pipeline is. And I kind of want to just like stop for a second and give the caveat, like, remember when I said I don't know how the inside of a toaster works? I'm also not an expert in specs, so I'm not going to go into this in any more detail than what you see on the screen. What I really kind of like gravitated towards was, okay, rendering timeline is very complex. Okay, that means complex to me. I hear somebody tells me something is complex. I think, okay, well then there are problems. I want to know what the problems are, and I want to know what those problems kind of look like out in the wild. So in Joseph's post, he did an analysis of 40 top Alexa ranked sites, and what he found was that 95% of first paint events occurred before start render, 85% of first contentful paint, and 50% of first meaningful paint events for these 40 sites. But these are top-ranked sites, all occurred before start render. So essentially, people were seeing pretty much a blank screen in these instances. So it's not to say that there's a problem with these metrics. And again, it's going back to that cat rodeo I talked about earlier, which is you just don't know how metrics are going to behave in the wild on your particular site. So kind of getting back to our checklist, these metrics, they're easy to use and accessible right out of the box. Do they correlate to what users see in the browser? Not 100%. Do they recognize that all pixels and page elements are equal? Not really, because they're just looking for pixels. They're not prioritizing. They're not actually able to intelligently look at your content itself. And you can't customize what you measure on specific pages. So kind of moving on to kind of the next sort of set of metrics that we got very excited about, and we've actually added them to speed curve. So first, CPU idle. You might know it as First Interactive. That's its old name. Its new name was recently changed by Google to make it kind of more meaningful. So the page is minimally interactive. Most of the visible UI elements are interactive, and it responds to input like reasonably quickly. And then time to interactive, again, used to have a name, a different name, time to consistently interactive. Now it's TTI. So it's just something to bear in mind if you're wondering where these new labels came from, or why, if you were using different tools that use Google naming conventions, why those names have changed. This is why. So again, it displays useful content and responds to user interaction within 50 milliseconds. So basically, it's just more responsive. So this is, again, sort of sanity checking what these metrics look like in the wild. Just on a few random sites, I just kind of pulled out one in particular. So what I like about these metrics is they show you when the page is actually usable. That's great. It's good to know that people can actually engage with the page in a kind of clickable way. But what was interesting is when you look at film strips, and I saw this in many film strips, what people see in the browser actually, visual content or significant visual content is rendered long before the page actually becomes usable. So these, the CPU idle metric and TTI, again, good to know that your page is usable. You wouldn't want to see a lag between visual content appearing on the screen and the page becoming interactive. But it's not necessarily a metric that you should gravitate towards as being, we just want to know when people are first seeing meaningful content. So kind of getting back to our checklist, easy to use and accessible out of the box. Yep, available by default. Recognizes and prioritizes that different page elements have different levels of importance, but doesn't always correlate to what people see in the browser because people are seeing something in the browser earlier, and doesn't allow you to customize content on your own page. So then what? So these are new metrics as well. They're almost a year old. We developed them at SpeedCurve, but we've open sourced them, so they're available in web page tests as well. And we call them hero rendering times. And what they are a set of proxies for that most meaningful content that people see in the browser. So for media sites, for example, it might be when your first H1 tag renders, because that's a headline for an article. For if you're also a media site, or if you're an e-commerce site, largest image, or as a kind of a backfill for that, largest background image usually correlates with whatever your hero image is on a page, or banner image, or product image, that sort of thing. And then first painted hero and last painted hero are just when that first hero element renders and then the last hero element renders. So kind of what they look like, H1 render is highlighted here. You can see, oh, okay, well that actually works pretty well. It's showing kind of what looks like maybe it's the most important text on the top part of the page. The largest image, okay, yeah, that looks like a pretty important image. It's definitely the largest image, so that seems like it's correlating pretty well. And then largest background image. So sometimes depending on how the page is built, largest image just doesn't work, and so largest background image can work as well. So, however, there are gotchas, there always are. One size fits most, not all. They don't work on all pages. It's really dependent on how the page is built. Hero, the largest background image, and largest image don't typically work on pages where there are pop-ups or image carousels, and kind of just break how that metric is collected. So, there's, it's good to know that these metrics exist. Are they one size fits all? No. So which metric is best of all the ones that I've just talked about? I've kind of said the pros and cons of each. Well, again, we like to investigate and we like to look at film strips. So Steve created this really awesome tool. You can actually go to it, it's live, and use it. We don't collect the data on it, it's kind of just for your own interest. At lab.speedcurve.com/rendering/picker.php. And what it is a long list of top sites, so all sites that you probably recognize, and film strip views for each site. And then you just select the frame that for you correlates to a meaningful user experience. You feel that enough content has rendered in that particular frame to consider that kind of like a meaningful amount of content for you. So it's highly subjective. It's all you based. And at the end of this page, after you've selected all the frames, and it won't tell you, you can't kind of change you can't change what you chose. Once you've selected it, that's it. You're kind of in unless you refresh and start over again. But at the end of this picker, it'll actually tell you what were the most important metrics for you. So it'll say, yeah, it was hero times for me 43 times, and speed index 22 times, and start render 15, and it'll actually show you all of that. And so it's just a really interesting little exercise, kind of thought experiment to kind of get you outside of maybe the kind of charts and spreadsheets world and into thinking about film strips and what you actually see. And it's pretty eye-opening stuff. And so I encourage you to do this, maybe share it with people in your team, compare your scores, kind of just sort of see where you're at. But I think it's really great for awareness building. And so what was the winner when we did a whole bunch of these and kind of collated everybody's scores? Again, this is not science. This is just sort of for fun. So I don't want you to take this away and say like, okay, this is what we need to gather around in terms of metrics. Sorry. So can you tell? It's not a unicorn. I know it looks like one. It's just a donkey with a plunger on its head. Anyway, so for delivering any content, start render seemed to be the metric that correlated with that. To deliver a significant amount of content was speed index and first meaningful paint. And to deliver critical content were the different hero rendering times. So you can read Steve's blog post where he kind of wrote about kind of the whole backstory behind how he created this and just all the thinking around this. It's really interesting stuff. So kind of going back to reviewing everything we just covered. So We found metrics that correlate to what people see on the browser, that are easy to use and accessible out of the box, that recognize that not all pixels and page elements are equal, but we still haven't gotten to customizing what we measure on specific pages. And this is where we get into custom metrics. So just quick show of hands, how many people in here are using or have used custom timers on their pages? Okay, so that's actually really great. So industry standard is actually only about 15% across, if you look at the HTTP archive, only about 15% of sites use custom metrics. In our world, we would love it if everybody used custom metrics, but they require a bit of expertise to implement. If you have really dynamic pages, you have to there's a bit of care and feeding involved in making sure that your timers are valid. So it's understandable why people don't necessarily use them, but we would definitely like to see them be more widely adopted. This stat is actually why we developed hero rendering times. This is because we wanted to give people something that was a proxy for what a lot of people try to track with custom timers anyways. So kind of going back here. So just what a custom timer is, just lets you put marks and measures around specific assets on the page. And actually, because custom timers via the user timing spec are supported by synthetic tools and real user monitoring tools, you can actually pull that data into both of those tools and see what your custom data is. And you can use it to do cool things, like Twitter. They use it for time to first tweet is a metric that they collect. At Pinterest, pinner wait time. And at cars.com, I don't know what the secret sauce is there, but they do have something called time to interact. They're a customer of ours, but I don't know any more about how they actually implement this. So custom metrics, check off a bunch of boxes. But are they easy to use and accessible right out of the box? No. So, there is no metric currently that ticks off all the boxes. It's just not, it just doesn't exist. So, but it's not, all hope isn't lost. So other things we can track. In real user monitoring, we can track really great things like first click, first scroll, first key, and recently first input delay. So first click, all these interaction times actually can measure in RAM when people start actually using your page. When do they first click? When do they first scroll? When do they first key? And you can see what they do first on your pages, and you can see if those things get faster or slower. And you can even see what they're clicking on and what they're interacting with on your page. And then first input delay lets you see what the delay is from the time the person began to engage with the page to when the page actually responded. So 4 milliseconds is quite good. We typically recommend no longer than 10 milliseconds. So you don't really have a unicorn metric, but really we have a lot of unicorn metrics. And actually, the fun fact, how many people here know, or does anyone here know what a whole bunch of unicorns is called? Anyone know? I looked this up. It's called a blessing. It's a blessing of unicorns. So rather than think that we've been unsuccessful, we haven't found any good metrics, what I really want you to think is we actually have a blessing of metrics, but they're going to require work on your part. And it's not a massive amount of work, but it's meaningful work and it's important work, and it's going to keep you, it's actually going to save you time down the road if you invest in doing this work up front. So we have all these metrics. What do we do with them? So as I said before, the best metrics for you are the metrics that you've looked at. So first you're monitoring your pages. Ideally, I hope everybody here is monitoring their pages with something. And then you're actually looking at your film strip views. And I've looked at thousands of film strips over the past few years, and weirdly, I find them really, really interesting, but I also like to walk around at night and look in people's windows when their lights are on, so not close up, just from the sidewalk. So maybe I'm weird, but I find it fascinating. I love looking at a stacked set of film strip views and seeing, why, out of all of these e-commerce sites, this one is fast, and this one is fast, and this one isn't rendering till over here. Oh, sorry. this one's fast and this one's slow, and so on. So, and drilling down from there. And with web page tests, we just have the ability to do that. You have the ability to look at your own site, look at your own film strips, and actually figure out what are the metrics that are most meaningful to your site and to specific pages, because a metric that really works for your product pages might not be a metric that works for your homepage, and you just need to know that and then focus on it. And so how you focus on it is performance budgets, yay. So they've actually been around for a long time, but it's really only been in the last year that I've noticed a lot of uptake in people being interested in them and trying to create their own. And I think Tim was actually one of the pioneers of really popularizing this idea of a performance budget as not just being like this cap that you had to stay within because it was like, I don't know, like your parents giving you a certain amount of allowance and then slapping you on the wrist if you came to them wanting more money, but really is kind of a target, a budget, like something to get excited about. Like I have 2 seconds to begin to show people meaningful content on the page. Great, how can I use those 2 seconds? What is the best way to do something within those 2 seconds? So as I kind of said, they're thresholds that you create for the metrics that are most meaningful to you. So they can be time-based metrics, they can be quantity-based metrics like page weight, image weight, number of blocking scripts, or they can be rules-based if you're tracking Lighthouse scores or things like that. And Adi Osmani wrote a really, really, really excellent post about recently about performance budgets that I recommend. That kind of just it shoots off in a lot of other directions from this concept and outlinks to a lot of great resources as well. So I really recommend that you look that up on his blog. So a good performance budget should show you what your budget is when you go out of bounds, how long you've been out of bounds, and then ideally when you come back within bounds. So what that could look like is this. So this is a performance budget for Start Render for Amazon, where I set the threshold for 2 seconds, which is, I think, a healthy goal. And then you can see how the site performs for Chrome, Firefox, and IE11 for that particular budget. And you can see that red line is the threshold at 2 seconds, and that mostly the homepage is within that threshold, and you can see where it spikes out, how it performed, and when it comes back down within budget again. So just a really great way to visualize, even for, like, trust me, I show charts and visualizations to all kinds of people ranging from super technical to really not technical. And a really well visualized performance budget can do a lot of the work that you want to do in communicating with the less technical people in your organization. And you can have budgets around third parties, like number of third parties on your page or the amount of JavaScript being used by third parties, that sort of thing. So because people always ask, so caveat first, super important stuff on the next slide. Please don't take a photo of this and then go back to your office and say, we have to move towards these budgets. I put these out because people always ask, they want to know, well, what is an idea? So I kind of put these out as kind of like toy box ideas. Take it off the shelf and sort of play with it a little bit, and maybe it's a good metric for your site, but maybe it's not, and maybe it's a good budget for your site or for your page, but maybe it's not. And I really, really want to stress that. So, and what I recommend people start with typically, if they don't have any other ideas, they're just starting cold, is Start Render, first painted hero, so that first hero element on the page, whatever it might be, speed indexed, first interactive, and first input delay. So the super important caveats, look at your own data. A really great way to set budgets for yourself, the nice thing about synthetic monitoring with web page tests and other tools is that you can test your competitor sites as well, and you can see how your competitors are performing. And so you can set your own performance budgets relative to what your competitors are doing. It's not enough to be under 2 seconds if all your competitors are under 1 second. So keep that in mind. Don't sandbag your performance budgets. Don't be like, oh, well, I want it to be under 3 seconds, but actually we're 4, so I'm just going to change that to 4 seconds. And look, our charts are beautiful. Although, having said that, it's okay to take kind of a step-by-step approach. You might be walking into, if you're kind of like fresh fish in a job, walking into a situation where start render is like 6 or 7 seconds, and you're tearing your hair out, and you want to implement performance budgets, but you also don't want to demoralize your team or anger your executive team. So take a stepwise approach. You're at 8 seconds, make the goal 6 seconds. And then once you've achieved that, make it 4 seconds. And then kind of take that stepwise approach. And then use synthetic and RUM if possible, for a lot of reasons. But in this case, it's because your numbers will vary. They will from different tools, because RUM, you're kind of being affected by the fact that people are visiting with probably a primed cache or somewhat primed cache. With synthetic, it's typically a fresh cache. So it's good to just kind of have those numbers side by side. And some more pro tips. The folks at Zillow wrote a really great blog post a couple of years ago that I think, even though it's a couple of years old, is still very relevant in a lot of ways, where they actually explain how they, or as kind of early adopters of the idea of performance budgets, kind of step through their approach. And one of the things I love about this industry is just all the sharing that happens, and the fact that a huge enterprise like Zillow is willing to actually say, this is how we did this thing. And so, yeah. Basically, just don't look at all your pages. Look at your most popular pages and your pages that change the most often. Review things early. Make sure you compare before and after deploys, and keep your budgets fresh. Update them. Don't just kind of get stuck in a rut of thinking this is the budget now. Keep looking at your competitors. So some takeaways. No unicorn metric. Use your eyes. It's, again, charts and spreadsheets are a great way of collapsing data and making massive amounts of data digestible, but there's no getting away from the fact that sometimes you just need to actually look at how your page renders for real users. And don't just look at averages and medians. There's a whole other kind of rabbit hole I could have gone down where we talked about that, but there's not enough time to do that. But look at your 95th percentiles. 95th percentile, that's still a pretty significant cohort of your users, and you want to know how the people who are in that kind of bottom cohort are faring when it comes to visiting your site, because it's a lot of folks. Set targets with budgets. Make yourself accountable. If you can get alerts sent to yourself on your budgets, that's great. And despite everything that I've said, it kind of feels overwhelming about the fact that new metrics are always coming our way, and things sometimes feel like they move pretty fast. Don't be afraid to explore new metrics. Don't get stuck in a rut of thinking that a metric that worked 2 or 3 years ago is going to continue to work. And so just don't be afraid to investigate them, and consider it's a kind of play. You can sandbox things on your own. You don't have to share things with your team. You can kind of go away and explore. And when you feel like you've created enough of a case for why a certain metric is valid for pages on your site, you can share that with people and start a discussion around that. And it's a really great way of getting people, I think it's quite invigorating. It's a way of getting people excited about performance and renewing that. So thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter, and I'm around. I'm going to be at the after party.
Can I steal you for a couple questions?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. I forgot. I
you don't get out that easy.
Thinking about the beer.
That's fair. I think we learned a lot from that talk, including to make sure that our curtains are closed if you ever happen to be out for a walk.
You should. You really should. I've seen a lot of things.
Good to know. So you went over a ton of different metrics, right?
Yeah.
And we've had this progression over the years where we keep swapping in what we think is the current best thing, and it keeps iterating, and we keep adding more metrics, and it's great. And because you showed on different sites, if you're not watching a couple more than 1 or 2, you can miss a big part of the experience. Is there a point where there's too many metrics that a company is monitoring? Is there a sweet spot, do you think, for the number of metrics that a company should actively paying attention to, or?
It really varies. So we have, so at Speaker, I talk to a lot of customers, and we have customers that their executives just want one metric. They kind of want, they want that unicorn metric, and you can't say it doesn't exist. Here it is. I found a unicorn. It's yours now, executive. And so you just find that one thing they care about. So sometimes it's just, believe it or not, all an executive member wants is the lighthouse scores. And so you just give it to that person. And so I think you have to really know your audience. Like, so for marketing people, if you're sharing, and I think you should be sharing your metrics with different teams in your org and not kind of keeping them all in your bunker. It could just be like your lighthouse SEO score and how your third parties are tracking and start render, and just kind of give them what is going to work for them. And you can tell, like if you're kind of people savvy and you're in a room talking with people, you should be able to sense when somebody's eyes are glazing over and you've lost them. And so ideally, the best performance metric isn't one that you're telling people, this is the metric we're tracking. It's you're collaborating with them and you're saying, what metric do you think we want to track? And you're helping to educate them about what the metric actually does and how it's meaningful so that they can be a champion for their own metric and take ownership over it. So, it really kind of varies from team to team. Yeah.
The Lighthouse one is interesting. Somebody actually did ask a question about Lighthouse where they had gone through a situation where they had focused on the Lighthouse audit, improved their score by like 10 points or whatever. But they were collecting RUM data in Google Analytics and saw like no meaningful change there. Do you have recommendations for people as they're making these optimizations for being able to isolate and dig deep and find out like where that's impacting and who?
Oh, that's like a whole other talk. So yeah, I mean, if you have your RUM data, you can import or integrate with other data sources, so your Google Analytics or Omniture or however you're tracking like cart size and conversions and your traffic numbers and so on. And you can make correlation charts like the one that I showed that it was a very simple one that just showed the correlation of start render to bounce rate. You can do charts like that with anything. So it's all possible. So it's kind of about just figuring out what the people on your team care about. So for executives, it would be, okay, well, let's show them how start render correlates to conversion rate or to revenue, that kind of thing.
How about monitoring flows? So you've been talking, all these metrics and stuff were kind of focused on that single page interaction, right? Any advice for folks who want to say, I want to see what happens on the product checkout journey from like searching for the product to the point that they check out and tracking the performance there? Is it like look at the individual scores and kind of combine them or aggregate them, or is there a better, more fluid approach there?
I would have to think about that. I don't know that I personally have any experience with that. So if somebody else has some, come and find me during the break and tell me about it.
Another one, somebody dug pretty deep, and I'm pretty sure this was you, like 2012-ish.
Yeah.
The performance poverty line. Do you remember? Yeah.
Yeah.
So first off, can you explain what that is?
Okay.
People don't. But then secondly, like, is that a metric that is it valuable for you as a company to know where that poverty line is?
Yeah. So the performance poverty line was again, it was looking at correlation charts. So it was looking at the histogram that showed like the traffic distribution across I think it was load time, and then looking at basically conversion rate. Across that histogram. And what we found was that conversion rate was high when pages were faster, not surprisingly, and then it kind of just did the dip down. But what we found was that kind of varied from site to site. So it was typically between like 4 to 8 seconds, depending on the site. It would hit this, we call it the performance poverty line, where once it hit that bottom level, even though pages got slower and slower, conversions didn't get worse. And so I'm kind of making it sound positive when it's actually not. What it means is that you could have a page that renders in 8 seconds, and you could shave 3 seconds off of the time for that page to render. And if you just made it 5 seconds, and your performance poverty line is 5 seconds, you actually haven't changed conversion rate at all. For your particular site, the poverty line is 4 or 5 seconds. Yep.
So it's not necessarily don't optimize, like don't try to like make that experience faster, but it's be cognizant of like what the business value is, which hopefully you're tracking anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, there are other reasons why you should optimize. I mean, I think there's kind of like a moral imperative to make people's pages smaller and faster, especially, you don't know what people's data plan situation is or how they're using the web in different situations. So I think like as a UX person, I will always tell you, make it as fast as possible, make it like instant. But from a business perspective, yeah, the performance poverty line is a real thing.
That was always my favorite response to how fast, whenever a client would ask that, is as fast as possible. But they'd like more precision than that, it turns out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.